Quick, think of a company you associate with fonts. Maybe you thought of Adobe, the makers of Photoshop and other design software, or perhaps you thought of Apple, who've dominated the creative industry on desktop for many years. I doubt that Microsoft was the first company that came to mind. But imagine for a moment 3 alternative universes. One where we have no Adobe, one with no Apple, and one without Microsoft. Between these 3 universes, which one, typographically speaking, would look the most different from our own? In this video, I'm going to look at how and why Microsoft have had a bigger impact on typography than any other company in the last half century, through 10 of their most famous and infamous fonts. First of all, just what is typography? Typography is everything about written communication that is visual. Analogies help, so let's use music. In music, we have the composition, which is the pure information of the song's notes and what order they're played in. To make that audible, a musician plays that composition using an instrument. We call that the musical performance. In written communication, we also have pure information called the text. To make that visible, a designer typesets that text using a font. We call this typography. Technically, font and typeface are different terms, but for this video, it's not important. Of course, there's more to typography than just picking a font, just like there's more to performing music than picking an instrument, but this gives us a basic framework. The second key concept in this video is democratization. In my music analogy, not all music is played by professional musicians, and definitely not all typesetting is done by designers. In fact, a tiny minority of typesetting these days is handled by professionals. A better analogy for this concept is photography. When you take a casual photo with your phone, chances are you're not thinking about f-stop, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. All of these settings still need to be calibrated, just not by you. It's done for you invisibly by software. Just as photography was once the exclusive domain of skilled professionals, typography has also been democratized. When you create a new document or shoot off an email, you're probably not conscious of tracking, kerning, and leading. You don't manually pick the page margin, and most of the time you don't even pick a font. All of these choices have been automated away. These changes all happened relatively recently. Up until the 1990s, when people wrote, they generally used a pen or a typewriter. Now, the former is a forgotten skill, and the latter is a vintage throwback. Neither handwriting nor typewriting were actually typesetting. That wouldn't happen until the mass adoption of the computer, and with it, word processing software. While Microsoft may not have pioneered all of the underlying technology or had all of the most original designs, their sheer market dominance meant that their influence was unavoidable through the era of the desktop PC. It's easy to forget in 2020 that Microsoft was once considered the biggest of all big tech companies and sued as a monopoly under US antitrust laws. For multiple decades, nearly everything important in computing was either instigated by or was made in reaction to Microsoft. In this video, we'll look at 10 major Microsoft system fonts. Love them or hate them, it's impossible to deny their significance. We'll attempt to look past their familiarity and dive deep into their origins, design, usage, and legacy over time. On the way, we'll stop at some of the major shifts in technology that shaped that trajectory before summing up and asking what comes next. But to begin, let us start. Our most recent font came bundled with Windows 7 onwards. It's the font used for all of Microsoft's branding, including their corporate logo, Windows, Office, Surface, and as the name suggests, the user interface from the Start menu to the File Manager in Windows 10. Perhaps the most notable thing about its design is its shady origin. After licensing the design from Monotype, Microsoft tried to trademark the design in the EU, where they were blocked by objections from Linotype, a rival type foundry that is a company that designs and distributes fonts. Linotype objected to its similarity to Frutiger, a well-known font of theirs that dates back to the 1970s. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but a key difference between the intellectual property law in the US and the EU is their protection for font designs. In the US, you can trademark the name of a font, and copyright will protect the specific code of the font files, but you cannot protect the design itself. Briefly, here's why. To simplify for our purposes, font files contain instructions, like a recipe, of how to draw the shapes that create the design itself. Now, two different recipes can give the same end result. For example, I can draw a semicircle using 2 points or 3 points. The outcome is the same, but under US law, despite being visually identical, copyright would not recognize these as the same recipe and therefore provide no protection. In Europe, a design itself may be trademarked, and that was the thing which Linotype disputed Microsoft over. The EU Intellectual Property Office sided with Linotype and denied Microsoft the design trademark. Coincidentally, Monotype, who created this knockoff design Segoe, and the biggest rival to Linotype through 120 years of history, finally bought Linotype out in 2006, just 2 years after the trademark dispute. Monotype will feature many times in this video as they are Microsoft's main type partner and supplier. Design-wise, there are very few differences to Frutiger. Here's Frutiger Next, a modernized version with true italics produced by Linotype, overlaid on Segoe with a few key differences highlighted. There are quite a few more differences in the italic alphabet than in the Roman. Being as such, it inherits all of its virtues from Frutiger, a font designed eponymously by influential Swiss designer Adrian Frutiger for Charles de Gaulle International Airport. Like Helvetica, another Swiss design, it's a neutral humanist sans serif. Humanist in this context meaning its lines follow traditional forms from classical Roman inscriptions and calligraphy, as opposed to the rigid, pure geometry of a font like Futura. Being designed for signage with the goal of legibility from a distance, Frutiger inadvertently mirrored the design challenge for on-screen legibility at low resolutions. So despite being designed in 1971, it shares many traits with purpose-made screen fonts, a large X height, and open apertures. We'll cover both of those in depth at a later point in the video. This makes it extremely legible for both on and off screen, despite coming from the pre-digital era. For that reason and its neutrality, Frutiger and its copycats have been hugely popular for corporate branding. In fact, for a few years, Microsoft and Apple were both simultaneously using Frutiger likes as their corporate typefaces. From 2002 to 2017, Apple's corporate font was Myriad, also the default font in Adobe's Creative Cloud. Myriad heavily borrowed from Frutiger, though slightly less blatantly than Segoe did. The uppercase proportions are narrower, and you can always spot Myriad by the sloping verticals on the uppercase M. Italic lowercase g, quite elegant. The unnecessary concavity of this numeral 4 purely thrown in to throw you off the scent of its copycat origins. The clearly pregnant ampersand. Calibri first appeared in Windows Vista and remains the default font for Microsoft Word and Office. It was part of the ClearType font collection, created to showcase a new sub-pixel font rendering technology that came with Vista. This was a group of 6 fonts that were commissioned from well-respected type designers, including, forgive my pronunciation, Lucas de Groot, the Dutch designer behind this font. Then all the fonts were given a name that begins with C so that nobody can ever remember which is which. Most of us have been desensitized to this design by repeated exposure, but when we make an effort to look a little bit harder, you'll notice it's quite an unlikely default font. It's hardly flavorless and neutral. The first thing which jumps out about its design is the rounded edges. The designer apparently proposed versions with and without the rounded corners, and this is the version that Microsoft preferred. Bear with me for a minute, but we're about to dive deep on rounded fonts. While not entirely common, rounded fonts have been around for a while. One of the most popular is VAG Rounded, designed for Volkswagen, and up until recently, it was the font used on all of Apple's keyboards. But VAG has true rounded stroke terminals. That is, the strokes in each glyph all end in a circular shape. The same is true of fonts like Gotham Rounded and Bryant. But the terminals in Calibri are not circular. They're rectangular with rounded corners. And this was until pretty recently a rare quirk in sans serif fonts. Apart from the century-old display font Bertold Block and Neo Sans by Seb Lester, it was difficult to find examples that predate Calibri, but after 2007 we see an explosion in this style of rounded font. Searching for the term round or rounded on my fonts brings up dozens of designs all post-dating Calibri, and it's a perfect example of the subconscious influence that Microsoft's system fonts can have. Something that was once quite rare and quirky suddenly feels common overnight because suddenly it's seemingly everywhere. The letterforms themselves are not particularly unusual. They have some of the inherited features of previous Microsoft screen fonts that we'll dig into later, but apart from the slight convex curve on the italic V, W, and Y, there aren't that many strange choices. But rounded corners are a strong choice. It's kind of like corduroy. You can take a perfectly forgettable suit, but make it all corduroy. Suddenly that's a bold choice. Which is why it's so perplexing that this is the default font for Microsoft Word. If it was just one of the other 5 clear type fonts beginning with C, I wonder how often people would actually end up using it. Fully rounded fonts we tend to associate with children. The roundness feels friendly and informal. Contrast that with the previous default font for Word, Times New Roman, which we'll get to later on. But there's a huge shift in tone switching from this to this. It's like moving from a stuffy Victorian print shop into suddenly a nobody wears ties here dude tech hub. A huge number of startups from the so-called Web 2.0 era, many of which disappeared after the 2008 financial crisis, used rounded fonts in all lowercase in their logos to project friendliness and approachability. Skype, owned by Microsoft, now looks like this, but their old logo was a famous example of this style. In 2020, it's decidedly passé, but that cultural association still lingers, and I suspect in a decade or two, it may come back again with a new twist. But when it comes to Calibri, despite these quirks and associations, to most people, it's practically invisible. It's the font that conveys only 2 things. You didn't manually pick a font, and you used a Microsoft product. This unique position has made Calibri a unique data point of forensic evidence, most famously in the case of corruption charges against the Prime Minister of Pakistan. His daughter provided documents supposedly dated from February 2006 to support the argument that she had not bought luxury properties in London with illegitimately sourced funds, but the documents were set in Calibri, which was not publicly available until Windows Vista was released in January 2007, pointing to the documents being a fraud. The jaunty angle of the non-crossing strike through the $sign. The way this line in the italic lowercase y goes from convex to straight as it crosses the baseline. The playful rounded square @ symbol. Before we discuss our remaining fonts, we need to talk about fonts on the web. In 2020, we are spoiled for choice. Embedding custom fonts online can be done in a few clicks, and hundreds of fonts are available for free. The early web could not have been more different. Have you ever opened a document which used a font you didn't have installed? You can tell because the layout looks weird and broken. Well, that was pretty much the early web when people tried to specify a font. Web designers could and did try, but there was no way to tell which fonts a user visiting the site might have installed on their system. It was chaos. For years, the Holy Grail was a universal standard for embedding custom fonts, so a site would look the same on an iPhone as it did in a browser on your laptop. But it was a long journey to get there, and it wasn't really a reality until the 2010s, with Microsoft one of the last companies dragging their feet to support this in Internet Explorer. Back in 1996, Microsoft proposed an interim solution. Since they had the biggest market share, everyone should just use their fonts, which they made free to download. These were the core fonts for the web, but they were really a greatest hits compilation, mixing older and newer Microsoft system fonts together. Our remaining 8 fonts all come from this collection. It's easy to forget how the web looked a dozen years ago, but it was strikingly different. For the better part of 20 years, a handful of Microsoft fonts were the de facto standard for every site on the internet. Sure, this was partly thanks to market forces, but one thing that all these fonts shared in common was a technical superiority to other fonts that was difficult to compete with. This is going to become technical, but please stay with me because I think it's something most people have never heard of before. We're going to cover a lot of technical history very quickly. I'll try to keep it simple, and I'm sure I'll mess up a technicality or two, so feel free to leave any corrections down in the comments. The first operating systems with graphical user interfaces used bitmap or pixel fonts. These were created by manually designing each letter pixel by pixel. This also meant that alphabets had to be drawn again and again for each point size available, and the design could look radically different at different sizes. When high-resolution laser printers came onto the scene, it became clear that bitmap fonts weren't really up to the task. The only available fonts suitable were Adobe's PostScript fonts, which were a proprietary format at the time, and Adobe wanted license fees from software makers, including Apple and Microsoft, to be allowed to use them. Apple then developed a competing format called Truetype, which was released with System 7 for Macintosh in May 1991. They licensed the technology to Microsoft for free to put pressure on Adobe and their licensing fees. Microsoft included Truetype with Windows 3.1, and Adobe eventually opened up the competing Type 1 format and lowered their fees as a result. One key technology of Truetype was hinting, and nobody invested more into the technology than Microsoft. Both Truetype and Adobe's Type 1 fonts are what are called outline fonts. They don't contain any pixel-specific instructions, only vector outlines. Like in our analogy before, these instructions are like recipes. Unfortunately, that gives you much less control over what the font will render like at different sizes on screen. For example, how do you take a capital E and shrink it so it's only 5 pixels high? Well, that's easy. But how do you shrink it down to 4 pixels high? Does the middle arm go in the second row or the third? Extrapolate this across hundreds of characters at dozens of sizes, and it adds up. Hinting was a solution to this problem. It was an extra layer of instructions on how to adjust those outlines at particular resolutions. The only problem was that this was extremely laborious and technical work, much more so than simply drawing bitmap fonts at multiple sizes. Oftentimes it was more work than designing the typeface itself. Only a handful of companies had the available resources to commit to this expensive task, and most famous among them was Monotype, especially in the case of Microsoft's system fonts. Did it make a difference? Absolutely. Pixels today aren't the same as pixels from the past. A mid-range smartphone has pixels nearly 40 times smaller than the average computer monitor from 1995. Also, CRT monitors from the past didn't produce the crisp, sharp pixels we see on modern LCD panels. Here's the difference between a well-hinted font, Arial, and an unhinted font around the same vintage. Microsoft knew that their system fonts would be used daily by millions of people and went the extra mile to ensure good screen rendering of their bundled fonts. In 2020, things are different. Font smoothing technology, first anti-aliasing, then sub-pixel rendering, have made hinting pretty much obsolete. In fact, except for Windows, modern operating systems on mobile and desktop just ignore font hinting entirely. But while the technology may be outdated, these considerations had a huge impact on the design aesthetic, as well as the successful spread and adoption of these fonts. While they might look ugly to our modern eyes on modern screens, these fonts were often a cut above anything else available at the time of their release. This font was designed by Vincent Courier, perhaps most famous for designing another font on this list, Comic Sans. Trebuchet feels the most unique of all these fonts, but unfortunately, also the most dated. It just evokes a particular point in time. the late 90s to early 2000s. It's so distinctive. It's like the PT Cruiser of fonts. Let's talk about why this design is so quirky. To me, there is a clear design influence on Trebuchet, and that is Eric Spiekerman's FF Meta, released in 1991. Logo designers loved it. You can still see it in a good number today. Meta was both innovative and influential. It broke a lot of rules with its distinctive design. Trebuchet is in no way a copycat of Meta, but there are definitely a number of key influences on display. Firstly, the lowercase g. Now there are two main styles of G, single story and double story. In the case of double story designs like this, the upper half is called the bowl and the bottom half is called the loop. Both Meta and Trebuchet have the rare and unusual feature of having an unclosed loop. Secondly, Meta has a unique motif of kinked vertical stems, seen at the ascenders of certain letters, but this also results in angled spurs at the top and the base of other characters. This is a signature of Spiekerman's style. One of his earlier fonts, 1990s ITC Officina Sans, features similar spurs. In Trebuchet's italic, the A, M, and N character followed this same template, but in the Roman form, they use more angular spurs. It's strangely inconsistent, but given the time period and the distinctness and popularity of Meta, its influence on Trebuchet, conscious or not, is pretty clear. Sadly, Trebuchet just has so many stylistic quirks, it was destined to age poorly. Like a guy with spiked bleached tips, wallet chain, cargo shorts, and a Smash Mouth t-shirt. There's the ET style ampersand and the low crossbar of the cap A, the elongated tail of the Q, the slightly truncated points of the V's, W's, and Z's, the tapered spur of the lowercase a, the high ear on the G, single serifed I and J, the unorthodox italic G and Y, and for some reason, the italic lowercase k is the only character which has a stroke terminated at an angle. I feel a little bad critiquing this font because I feel Vincent Conair has already received more criticism than any other font designer in history. Despite its flaws, I still like Trebuchet for its nostalgic charm. It's a product of its time, but it certainly was not forgettable. You can still see this font in the logo for NPR, National Public Radio. The italic lowercase e, the broken vertebra in the neck of the italic lowercase g, the vertex in the uppercase M truncates below the baseline. Released concurrently but designed a few years prior to Trebuchet is Georgia by Matthew Carter. It was hinted by Tom Rickner, who was lead typographer at Apple for many years and supervised their first Truetype fonts. Georgia is quite unique amongst these fonts for being a serif font designed specifically for on-screen usage, one of the most influential, if not the first. Carter was working on this design as a print font before Microsoft contacted him, and he released the print version as a typeface called Miller. So informatively, we can do a little comparison between the two to see how the design was changed for improved rendering on screen. Both these fonts were modeled after serif fonts produced by the Miller Type Foundry of Edinburgh, Scotland in the 19th century. But clearly of the two, the numerals in Georgia have been modernized and simplified for the screen. Georgia is unusual in using this style of numbers called text figures or non-lining figures. Most pre-installed fonts come with lining figures as the default, Georgia being the exception. I've highlighted some of the key differences between the letter forms on screen, but the most important change is to the italics. Miller's italics are much skinnier, more ornate, and they also have much finer, extended, acute terminals. In Georgia, these are flattened to a minimum, and the letters are much wider to enlarge the counters or internal negative space. The letter forms are simplified to make them more recognizable to a modern reader. Aesthetically, I personally prefer the look of the print font. It feels more period accurate and the letter forms are more interesting. I love, for example, Miller's italic V. However, good typography is not about beautiful letters, it's about beautiful and readable words. By that metric, George's italics are much better designed for the task. I think Matthew Carter really understood what he was doing, and he didn't let stylistic authenticity get in the way of legibility. As a type designer, that's a difficult thing to do. I mean, look at that 19th century ampersand. It's gorgeous, but it's not practical for a modern screen font. Georgia is still popular today because there just aren't many fonts like it. Despite a plethora of screen-optimized sans serifs, serif fonts designed for on-screen text are still thin on the ground. There are a handful of exceptions: Merriweather, Bitter, Recia, and Bookerly commissioned by Amazon exclusively for use on Kindle devices. Most new serif fonts tend to be revivals of old metal type or decorative headline type, and that's fine, but there should be room for more loose interpretations like Georgia, which put function ahead of formalism. So despite the web not being bound to 10 fonts anymore, Georgia still remains somewhat relevant. The perfectly recurring detail of this tiny diagonal chamfer on the top right corner of glyph stems. Italic lowercase I. Matthew Carter's offset numeral 8. Impact has a strange origin. It was cut by a British type designer in the 1960s to imitate a German display font which wasn't available in the UK market, so he made his own version. This was produced as metal type and sold by Stevenson Blake of Sheffield, England, an industrial town known for its steel production. It was later digitized and rights were bought by Monotype, who then licensed it to Microsoft. Impact, being a display font, is an outlier in this group. It was never intended for long blocks of small text, but instead for large, short headlines. In fact, its intended use was for print advertising. The designer said his goal was to use up as much ink as possible. We see that reflected in the design. The counters, the internal negative space, are extremely narrow. The forms are very boxy, though not particularly quirky, but there are a few details worth pointing out. Impact has an unusually short ampersand. Most ampersands are set at cap height, not X height, so that's definitely unusual. The fact that the hash and at symbol don't match the weight of the alphanumeric characters mark it clearly as a pre-digital font, since these symbols were pretty rarely used in display type in the 1960s. A design detail that was lost in its transition from metal to digital type were these rhomboid dots on the I and the J. Impact may have ended up with the most undignified of fates, used in Microsoft Word art and internet memes. Thankfully, both of these phenomena seem to have ended for now, and Impact can enjoy a little dignity in its retirement years. I made a whole separate video investigating which fonts people are actually using in image macro memes in 2020. If you'd also like to see me do a video on the history of word art, please let me know down in the comments. This majestic pound sterling symbol. The symbols which don't quite match. The cantilevered question mark. Verdana is perhaps the screen font, but before we dissect it, we need to talk about its older brother, Tahoma. Both were designed by Matthew Carter and hinted by Tom Rickner, the same team that worked on Georgia. Tahoma is a bit of a puzzle. The most glaring difference between it and Verdana is the fitting, the space between the letters. It's much tighter than Verdana and therefore less legible. It was used for the default interface font in Windows 2000 and XP, and for that, the tighter spacing makes sense, but it wasn't used in Windows 95 when it was released at the same time as Verdana, which is much more fleshed out. In many ways, Tahoma feels like Verdana beta. Tahoma has no italic or oblique version. There are subtle differences as well in the proportions and line work, but Verdana and its brother both have the same fundamental form. It's reminiscent of fonts like Frutiger, but the curves are much boxier. Imagine inflating a balloon inside a shoebox. This was to create as much interior space as possible to improve rendering at small sizes. It has that large X height, so proportionally the lowercase letters have very short ascenders and descenders. Think about rendering a lowercase k in a 6x6 pixel square. If you have a very tall ascender and relatively short X height, it's not going to be very clear, but if you reduce the amount of space you need for the ascender proportionally, it becomes a lot easier to make it legible. It also features wide open apertures. Compare the C from Helvetica and Verdana. In Helvetica, the aperture is quite tight, and at small sizes, it visually looks close to an O. Whereas in Verdana, the space is opened up, which means it renders much more distinctly. This is also true for other letter forms. Another defining trait is the jump in weight from regular to bold. Remember, these were intended for usage without anti-aliasing. So pixels were binary, either on or off, no shades of gray. For example, how would you take a lowercase l that is 1 pixel wide and make it bold? Well, you have to make it 2 pixels wide, which means the stroke thickness effectively doubles. This is a much more dramatic shift between regular and bold than with fonts designed for print. As far as the letter forms themselves, there isn't much quirkiness going on. It's straightforward and minimal. The only extraneous detail is this unmatched serif on the lowercase j, which is missing from the lowercase I, but this may have been done intentionally to make them more visually distinctive at low resolution. Verdana was the most legible font for small text usage online up until the 2010s, and it's the only neutral sans serif font in the core web font pack that was designed for screen first. I'd say it even defines its own genre of sans serif type, separate from previous classifiers. This design was born out of technical necessity, not out of stylistic convention. One of the most notable public font outrages in the last 20 years was when IKEA changed its font from Futura to Verdana in 2009. Even non-designers were vocal in their disapproval. Articles were written in the New York Times and Time magazine about a font. In 2019, without anywhere near as much fanfare, IKEA switched over to a custom version of Noto, an open license font commissioned by Google. From Monotype, Noto does a much better job of working across both sides of the digital divide, but it was also free of many of the technical constraints that Verdana was designed under. The rationale for both fonts was the same. IKEA wanted a consistent brand typeface in both print and web, but technology was just different in 2009. The reaction against Verdana was a combination of font snobbery and cultural dissonance. The idea that IKEA, a design-focused company, would move from a stalwart classic of 20th century modernism like Futura to a common system font from Microsoft messed with people's expectations. And in the case of IKEA, people feel emotionally invested with the brand. They use IKEA products to furnish their homes, and therefore it becomes a reflection of their own good taste. So when IKEA switch to a font they think is ugly or mundane, it hurts people's self-image, evoking a strong reaction. That Matthew Carter figure 8. The redundant and confusing existence of Tahoma. The flat horizontal bridge adjoining the A and loop in the @ symbol. You knew this was coming, right? The world's most notorious font, Comic Sans. I venture to say more words have been written about this font than any other typeface in history, and that's its own kind of achievement. Comic Sans was designed for one particular use case, for text in dialog boxes, for a Clippy-like virtual assistant in a program designed for children, Microsoft Bob. It then ended up as a bundled font with Windows 95. I'm not much of one for flogging the corpses of horses, so I'm gonna leave the critique on this one. If we compare it to a true comic book lettering font from Comicraft or Blambot, of course Comic Sans falls short, but it was never intended to be an accurate comic book font. More bizarre to me is the fact that Apple, perhaps due to the sheer popularity of Comic Sans, made its own blatant ripoff called Chalkboard, yet it continues to distribute both Chalkboard and Comic Sans with macOS. One aspect of lettering design which dyslexic people struggle with is the consistency of letter forms, especially the repeating shapes across letters. Inadvertently, the inconsistency of letter shapes between characters in Comic Sans might make it easier to read for people with dyslexia as far as system fonts go. That's the positive. On the negative side, being exposed to the public at large, there have been a lot of uses of Comic Sans that have been described them as less than optimal. There is a lot to unpack in the social dynamics between the love and hatred of Comic Sans and the sneering that comes along with some of that mockery. Needless to say, there is a time and a place for Comic Sans. It's 2 p.m. at Timmy's birthday party, he's turning 6 and everybody just wants to have a good time. For every other time and place, there exists an alternative, more appropriate choice of font. But many people who choose Comic Sans aren't aware of those alternatives. But that's a different video. The lowercase b is pretty acceptable. The bad kerning. You know it when you see it. At last, we reached the original Trinity. Now, if you remember earlier, I mentioned that Apple developed the Truetype format and gave it away to Microsoft, but they didn't give them their fonts. At the time, Apple was licensing fonts from Linotype, amongst others, which is why their first 3 Truetype fonts were Helvetica, a Linotype exclusive, Times Roman, no new, and Courier, also no new. Microsoft, on the other hand, was working with Monotype, and so they ended up with 3 fonts that were compatible with, but not the same as the system fonts from the Mac. Firstly, there's Times New Roman. Now, the Times in Times New Roman comes from the Times newspaper of London. It was commissioned by the paper from Stanley Morrison back in 1931. Back then, newspapers were printed with metal type, and there were 2 competing technologies. One from Monotype and one from Linotype. The Times newspaper used both for different purposes, so each type foundry ended up with a different version of the typeface in their catalog, and that is how Mac and Windows ended up with 2 versions of the same core design. Although nearly identical, there are a few differences. The percentage and the @ sign, bold uppercase J, as well as the italic cap A, V, and W, and lowercase z. More importantly though, the Monotype version, Times New Roman, was designed to be metrically compatible with the Linotype version, which was released first. A font's metrics are its spatial attributes, how much space is given to each letter and how much space each pair of letters have between them. Metric compatibility basically means you can substitute the 2 fonts one for the other and text will not move or reflow. All 3 of these last Microsoft fonts, Times New Roman, Courier New, and Arial, are all metrically compatible with their Apple counterparts. As for the letter forms themselves, to our 21st century eyes, these just look like normal serif type, but in fact, Times has a mishmash of features from different schools of thought in serif type design, dating quite a few centuries apart. Here are 3 typefaces cited as models for the design of Times New Roman, each from a different period. There's Plantin, an old-style serif, Baskerville, a transitional, and Dido, a modern serif. Categorizing type is as much art as science, so we'll leave a detailed breakdown of what those labels mean for a different video. Overall, the glyph designs in Times New Roman borrow inspiration from all 3, though particularly in the lowercase and uppercase Roman, we see a leaning towards the stroke contrast and forms of Baskerville, with the stroke stress closer to that of Plantin's. In the italic forms, Perpetua, a typeface Morrison had previously worked on with Eric Gill at Monotype, shows its influence, as well as a general leaning towards a simpler, slanted Roman approach over that more calligraphic, compressed form of older styles. The mixed usage of italic and Roman together for emphasis and titles was not common until the 17th century, and Morrison was a staunch critic of the poor harmonization between Roman and italic forms in older typefaces. While we now take Times versions of these letters as standard, it was certainly novel back in its day. There are also some features which point at its newsprint past. The exaggerated, sharpened serifs, which helped with the less than perfect quality paper it was printed on, as ink tends to spread or bleed into the paper, creating a bolder, thicker appearance than the original type once it was printed. The uppercase letters are a bit narrower to help fit more words per line. Also, to help usage at small sizes in print, the X height is slightly larger, with shorter ascenders and descenders than the designs which inspired it. All of this inadvertently helped it make the transition to the screen. Times New Roman is so common as to be invisible. Through its unique place as the default font in Microsoft Word until the introduction of Calibri, it's become institutionally entrenched in document formatting standards for many academic institutions and government bodies. A viral marketing firm even released a font called Times Newer Roman, a hacked version with slightly wider glyphs to help students fake reaching their minimum word count. Nobody's gonna do that for Baskerville or Garamond anytime soon. The italic ampersand is quite handsome. The ear on the G is rounded in Roman but squared in italic, utterly confounding. The italic uppercase Q. Courier New is a digitization of a typewriter font developed for IBM in the 1950s. IBM did not trademark the name, and because the US system doesn't protect designs, this monotype version could blatantly copy both. The bold versions postdate IBM's design. Not all typewriter fonts have serifs. Courier does, and they're rounded slab serifs, which is quite distinctive. Typewriters were restricted to monospaced, also known as fixed width fonts, due to how they worked mechanically, at least until the very late models. This means that every letter and character, including punctuation, are the same width. A capital M gets the same space as a comma. This is where the practice of double spacing after a full stop or period became popularized. By the way, if you're watching this, please don't double space except when using a monospaced font. Every time you do, a designer somewhere gets carpal tunnel syndrome. Anyway, this leads to some particular characteristics. You see, the lowercase I has very wide serifs to fill as much space as possible, while the serifs on the M are barely there. All things we expect to see in a fixed width font. Some particular quirks of Courier: the lowercase x has serifs that are basically all but internalized, and the dot on the lowercase j is offset from the main stem, but it's not the case with the I. The monotype version we're familiar with has been criticized by many who are forced to use it in print for its very light stroke weight. Compare it with the version made by Bitstream for Apple, and it's visibly a lot lighter. Those people who might need to use it include screenwriters, as the film and television industry have settled on 12-point Courier as the standard formatting. Specialized screenwriting software Final Draft even has its own proprietary version of Courier that comes bundled. There have been a number of alternative versions made, including an open licensed version called Courier Prime, which has true italics. Uppercase J, quite distinct, though the Bitstream cut is more elegant. Overbite on the bold lowercase c. Uppercase Q. At last, Arial. We end this list as we started it with the rivalry between Linotype and Monotype. Linotype had exclusive rights to Helvetica, which was well loved and relatively well known as far as typefaces went in the pre-digital era. Monotype was contracted to provide fonts to IBM for their early printers, and sub-licensed Helvetica from Linotype as one of these fonts. Sometime after this, Arial was developed as a metric-compatible replacement, which they substituted to avoid continuing to pay Linotype for the rights to Helvetica, and thus a copycat was born. First, how can we tell one from the other? There are some key giveaway characters. For Helvetica, look for the spurred lowercase a, the beard on the uppercase G, and curved leg on the uppercase R. For Arial, look for the wavy tail on the capital Q and for the diagonal terminal on the top of the lowercase t. Arial uses diagonal terminals throughout, but the T is the easiest place to spot it. Helvetica's terminals are always at 90-degree angles. There are other subtler differences too, but these are the ones which you can spot at a glance. On the whole, Arial has many of the same strengths and weaknesses as Helvetica, though the changes made to the uppercase letters in particular make it a little bit less elegant than its progenitor. It's a perfectly legible sans serif with little flavor of its own. It's that blandness that makes it hard for people to hate Arial with the same fervor that Comic Sans seems to provoke. Diagonal terminal on the lowercase f, at least it's rational. Awkward fluctuation of stroke weight on the uppercase r. Sharp diagonal terminal on lowercase t. I wanted to end this list with Arial because it embodies so much of Microsoft's philosophy in type. If there is a through line in this set of 10, the best ones are those we hardly even notice. It's a functionalist philosophy of type. Fonts should serve the text. It's not the instrument, it's the music. Matthew Carter, the designer of Georgia and Verdana, understood this principle. In a New Yorker profile on Carter, Alec Wilkinson connects this to the type scholar Beatrice Ward, who wrote, "The most important thing about printing is that it conveys thought, ideas, images from one mind to other minds." Ward felt the best type was transparent, unnoticeable, so that text could shine on its own merits. Her analogy was that a stunning stained glass window is a failure as a window, because a window should be something you look through, not at. All objects are a product of their time. A lot of the fonts that we find ourselves with today are the result of the technology and business rivalries of the past. Some of them have become obsolete through changes in technology and now look out of place, perhaps even ugly. But none of that should condemn these as bad design. Even Comic Sans was well designed to meet its original brief. During their peak, Microsoft did more to democratize typesetting than any other company, and so the typefaces that came bundled with their software became the de facto standard for millions of people. Most people have never downloaded a font in their life, but they know the difference between Arial and Times New Roman. For an era, these fonts defined what we expected type to look like. If we see a capital W or a lowercase z that look different, these are the models we compare them to, consciously or not. Before Microsoft, there was no fixed point of reference that was culturally shared on such a massive scale. But in 2020, it feels like the era of Microsoft's dominance is in the past. And I think we can point to the moment the torch got passed on. In late 2016, global internet traffic from mobile devices surpassed traffic from desktop computers for the first time. Since then, mobile traffic has taken the largest share the majority of the time. Most of the reading we do now is online, and Windows doesn't have the market dominance in that space that it had in the past. You can see that under CEO Satya Nadella how Microsoft have changed tactics in response to this new position. The channel Tech Alta has an excellent video breaking this down, which I'll link down in the description. Truthfully, although Microsoft's market dominance meant their presence in our lives felt inescapable over the last 30 years, even down to the fonts we read on our screens and in our mail, that doesn't feel like the world that we're heading into. Typographically speaking, Google now feels like the presence we can't escape. Even if you don't own an Android device, chances are you're reading Google fonts every day on the web without realizing it. YouTube is a Google platform, but even outside their massive ecosystem, Google web fonts have become the default system fonts of the web. When the dust finally settled on web standards for font embedding, Google were quick to establish a one-stop repository of open license fonts that were free to use. But that's another video. I hope you've enjoyed this one, looking back at 10 significant fonts from Microsoft's history. It's been a lot of work to put together, but I feel we often learn the most from looking closer at the things we take for granted. It might be more exciting to talk about the automotive design of a rare Ferrari or Bugatti, but if you want to learn about the design that impacts the average person's experience, there's a lot more to be gleaned from looking at a Toyota Camry. If you've watched all the way through, thank you for spending your time with me. Please let me know down in the comments if you'd like to see a breakdown like this for Google, Apple, or Adobe next, though it will probably do some shorter videos in between. Feel free to ask me a question in the comments, or you can reach out through my own personal site, timesnewbowman.com. That's with a B. This channel is still new, and as I record this, I have almost 200 wonderful subscribers. So if this is the kind of content that you enjoy, why not join us? And if you share it with people you think will find this interesting, that helps me out immensely. My name is Linus. I've been talking way too long about fonts, and I hope I'll see you in a future video.